Hello and welcome to the Americano Show. Today we're going to be talking about revolutions because this book is now out, The Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present by the very distinguished Fareed Zakaria, who I'm delighted to say joins me here in the Spectator's office. Fareed, thank you very much for coming in.
It's a huge pleasure to be here.
So Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present. The sort of drift of this book, I think, is that liberalism is a revolutionary thing. There are constant revolutions, disruption, which leads to technological change, which leads to disruption, I should say, which leads to identity crisis, which leads to disorder, upheaval, and so on. And this has been going on for a long time. And so even though today a lot of people feel we're living in a sort of revolutionary age, what you're saying essentially is this has been the case for some time.
Exactly. I think you have it exactly right. The way I see it, ever since the beginning of the kind of liberal Enlightenment project and the application of those ideas in states, in the Netherlands, in Britain, in America, what you've seen is this pattern of technological, economic progress, transformations, which then produce identity transformations. I mean, you see it right with the Dutch, where as they start to succeed, they start to think of themselves as differently. We're not part of the Habsburg Empire. We're Dutch. We're not part of Christian Europe. We're Catholic. We're Protestant. We're not part of Catholic Europe. And those identity revolutions almost always become part of a cultural maelstrom that then produces a backlash. And what I would argue is we're now living through the enormous backlash of 30 years of extraordinary change, economically, technologically, in identity terms, in the Western world, but even beyond the Western world.
You have a very interesting chapter on France as a sort of the revolution that failed because Catholic monarchy was restored eventually. I mean, it didn't really fail, though, did it? Because it actually caused revolutions elsewhere. You had the Napoleonic Code that came out of it. I mean, France is what it is because of the revolution today.
Yeah, so in a way, the way I would put it is it sort of failed on my terms, which is what I'm trying to understand is how do you navigate these periods of extraordinary revolutionary change where you have, lots of change in society, and how do you get to a place that's stable, enduring, and things like that. And in France, what happens is the change comes not bottom up from technology and economics, but it comes top down. A bunch of political elites decide to take a country that was still very, old-fashioned, very agrarian, had not urbanized, had not industrialized, and they force-feed an enormous amount of change, kind of abstract ideas onto the society, and it doesn't hold. As you say, the simplest way to make the argument it failed is the French Revolution begins with the execution of the French monarch. It ends with Napoleon pronouncing himself monarch. So even on its own terms, it fails. But more generally, if you think about that period, if you look at Britain and France over the last 300 years, today they're both liberal democracies. But Britain, since the Glorious Revolution, has essentially had continuous constitutional government in that period and incremental reform. I know I sound like a Whig, but I suppose I am. France, in the meantime, has in that same period had one revolution, 5 republics, 2 empires, 1 crypto-fascist dictatorship, 1 socialist commune, and 2 periods of occupation. So it's been a roller coaster ride, and most societies, I think, would prefer the English model.
But if we look at today, and you talk about populism in the book, I suppose a lot of the people who are concerned about revolution, or who think perhaps we need a revolution now, do feel that everything's top down now, and that democratic responses, like, let's say, the election of Donald Trump, the Brexit, those were democratic events that elites sort of regarded with a kind of aristocratic condescension. That they're getting it wrong. We need to contain what democracy is telling us.
I think that's right. I think that what's happening right now, in one way to analyze what's happened over the last few decades is you've had these 30 years of enormous change and transformation, and that period of change has empowered a group of people, a kind of new meritocratic elite in much of the world. These people are educated, they're urban, they tend to be cosmopolitan, they tend to be, in the broadest sense of the word, liberal, cosmopolitan. And there's a large part of the country in every society that deeply resents them, that deeply resents that power that they have. And in some senses, Brexit and the Trump vote and the Le Pen vote and the Bolsonaro vote in Brazil is a kind of reaction to it. It sometimes comes from the left. Lopez Obrador's voters in Mexico, in some sense, very similar. There is a kind of antagonism to this liberal, educated, cosmopolitan, urban elite. Much of the time in Europe, it's coming from the right, partly because the elite has tended to be center-left. But there are places where you see it the other way around, like Argentina just had one, right? And there, the elite was a Peronist left-wing elite. So the attacker, the insurgent, was Milei, who's a right-wing outsider. But they're all outsiders in some sense.
So that's why you think the more successful populism of today tends to be right-wing, whereas previously you talk about the populist party in America in earlier centuries. Previously, it was the left rebelling against the right. But you would say it's a rebellion against the elite that has changed.
I think that's right. And I think partly what's changed, I've been puzzling over this, and I talk about it a bit in the book, is, we've moved up the Maslow's hierarchy. We've created mass middle classes in much of the Western world. And that was the historic aspiration of the left. And we have moved to a post-materialistic politics that seems much more defined by identity issues. Whether it's women's rights, whether it's ethnic issues, whether it's sexual issues. And in that bloody crossroads, if you will, the right tends to do well because the left often kind of goes too far, and but that's on that playground. I think what ends up happening is when you live we're going through a cultural backlash, the right does better. Tony Blair once said this to me. I quote him in the book, saying this: that when people feel deep anxiety, they tend not to move left economically, they move right culturally. Because if you feel like your world is going away, your instinct is not, can I have one more government program? It's, who the hell are these people coming into my village and changing my world?
Yeah. Well, the old expression used to be, I'm going to get this wrong, but the left won the culture war, the right won the economic war, and the centre won the political war. But that's been scrambled in recent years.
I think that's exactly right. I think that the left is no longer winning the cultural war, partly because I think it pushed too far, too fast. But you're exactly right. I mean, I've always thought that when people said that, even about the Cold War, the basic story is that capitalism won. It's not really. The real story is that social democracy won. I mean, if you look at the program of the German Social Democratic Party circa 1900, 1910, every Western society has adopted almost every one of those platforms, which were opposed by every right-wing party in Europe at the time. So, we really have achieved a kind of synthesis now, and which is why I think we've set the stage for a new era of politics that is less about economics and more about these post-material cultural identity issues.
I suppose a free market critique of that would be to say that really what we have now is a kind of corporatism between big companies and governments. And, the phrase people use is socialism for the rich. And I think a lot of people feel that is true. Do you think they have a point when they say that?
They do have a point, but I'll tell you why it's happened. It's part of this kind of synthesis we've arrived at. We used to have much less corporatism, but we also had a much more volatile market. So when you look at the recessions of basically all the recessions before the Great Depression, governments would not intervene, would not bail companies out, would not bail banks out. And those depressions would sometimes last 15 years. I mean, the recession of the 1870s basically goes on for 20 years. It's inconceivable in modern middle-class democratic society that we would say, let's let the bad banks be liquidated, that'll cause all those deposit holders to lose their money. That world doesn't exist. So it's partly because you want to stabilize the society, the economic basis of society. The instruments you end up using are often big companies to do it. So we have a kind of democratic, a soft version of democratic socialism. I don't think it's entirely fair to call it socialism for the rich. I mean, every Western society does massive wealth transfers every year. I mean, if you look at the amount of money Western societies spend on health insurance, unemployment insurance, pensions, all those programs to housing to help poor people, that's also socialism in a sense, right? So every now and then, every 10 years when there's a financial crisis, we bail out the banks. For the other 10 years, we're helping a lot of poor people. I would say it's more generally speaking, a very activist interventionist state, while at the same time having a fairly healthy capitalist system. And the reason we've come to this place is, it may be a flaw of our times. It may be a characteristic, which is we can't take the pain. We cannot. I cannot imagine a modern democratic society saying, let's have a 6-year recession which wrings out all the excesses of this particular frothy era of growth. No, nobody would stand for that.
So what you're saying is that we are spoiled.
Or I'm saying that we found a way to adapt capitalism, regulate it, tame it, to a point where, perhaps you pay a certain price. Maybe we're not, quite as productive as we were, but you don't have that downside of. I mean, I think people forget what a kind of hellish descent into poverty it meant for large parts of the country when you'd have these 10, 15-year recessions in the 19th century. I mean, that's what produces, the communism. That's what produces fascism. It's that sense that society was incredibly volatile, and you could really slip through the cracks, and they were more than cracks. They were gaping holes.
Yes. But as you say in the book, it's relative deprivation, not deprivation, that causes political anger.
Yes, always. I mean, that's. But I do think when you look at the elections in Britain or the United States, the issues on people's mind. Yes, of course, economics is always important, but the issues stirring people's souls are immigration, their identity, issues of this issue of assimilation. Are we losing our country? In the United States, abortion on the left is a huge issue. I think and the fact that everywhere immigration seems the rocket fuel for the populist right, what it tells me is that is in a sense a symbol of the backlash against 30 years of globalization and information technology and all that, because all those forces are abstract. How do you put your finger on the global transfer of capital or even goods and services? But you can look at immigration is the human face of all these changes.
But do you ever think that sometimes people who are angry about immigration are told, oh, I know what you're saying, you're actually just disorientated by social change, and you think you're angry about immigration, and yet electorates keep saying, no, we're definitely angry about immigration?
No, I'm not. As you know, I take immigration very seriously, and I think that basically the populist right, if you want to put it that way, is right about immigration. Partly because immigration has gotten confused with asylum, and basically the asylum system has broken down. Immigrants are using the asylum system as a kind of way to do an end run or to cut the line, and that whole system as a result is not working. What I'm saying is, I think people are also upset about things like, the kind of borderless world of globalization. They're upset about the fact that, the massive expansion of information technology has meant that knowledge workers get massively overcompensated, and people who work with their hands have completely lost the way to make a living. But it's difficult to know whom to blame for the internet, whom to blame for global transfer, fund managers moving money out of certain countries and therefore punishing them and rewarding others, So I do think it's true that immigration, in a sense, is the symbol, and as a result bears the weight of more than just immigration.
I suppose maybe the best example of what you're talking about today could be America in 2024, because you talk to anyone who works in finance, and they'll tell you America's, it's absolutely roaring at the moment, and everything's. It's the only country which is really gearing up to change. But Americans don't seem to feel that way. They keep saying the cost of living is one of their biggest concerns, even if wages may be going up. And Donald Trump is currently favourite to win the presidential election in November.
You're absolutely right. It's one of the strangest paradoxes right now. The American economy, by any objective measure, is at a historic high. Unemployment is at a 50-year low. Inflation is 3%. Wages have been outstripping the cost of living for years now. Things like inequality have been declining for the last 3 years. Black labor participation is today higher than white labor participation, never been true in American history. And Joe Biden has the lowest approval ratings of any president in American history.
Yes.
And if you scratch the surface, what you find is the issues, that people are deeply gripped by are immigration, abortion on the left, the woke agenda, this feeling that, again, we're losing our country. And I think Biden's strategy, to the extent it's wrong, is he keeps thinking if he spends a bit more money on the red states, and God knows he's been lavishing money on them, all these infrastructure programs, they all go to the parts of the country. It's very much what you guys have tried to do with the leveling up and all that. And it's not getting him any votes because those people aren't voting against him because he's not giving them money. They're voting against him because they think, he's taking the country in a place that they don't want it to be, multicultural, diverse, all the, it's a kind of much deeper sense that you're not part of my world.
Yes. Well, you do say in the book, Joe Biden is that rare politician who has genuine concern for non-college Americans, given his roots in that world. That was probably true when he was elected. I think a lot of Americans wouldn't agree with that statement.
Well, but look at what his program is. As I say, if you look at his economic programs, Buy America, massive investment in manufacturing, chip ban on China, 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. He has done much more to protect and encourage American blue-collar labor than any president. You'd have to go back, I don't know, to Franklin Roosevelt to find somebody who's done. And my point is, we can have a discussion about whether it's working economically. It's, as you point to the polls, it's not working politically. Those people are still voting for Trump because we're in a age of cultural warfare, and he's on the wrong side for most of those people. They appreciate the job, thank you, but they're still going to vote for Trump.
Well, it could be what you mentioned in the book, which is Pascal, the infinite abyss, a sort of spiritual crisis, post-Christian perhaps in the West.
I think that's very much part of it. I think we've never completely grappled with the degree to which, the center of Western life has been religion, culture, tradition, and community. And kind of one by one, each of those things has been disrupted by all this change, by the great liberal enlightenment project working its way by capitalism. There's a great book that Daniel Bell once wrote called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. And he talks about how, you'd have these conservative businessmen spending the first half of their speech talking about capitalism and extolling its virtues, and the second half of their speech extolling the virtues of tradition, and never realizing that the first half of the speech was entirely in contradiction with the second, because the forces that are dissolving culture and tradition and are capitalism. It's the ultimate dissolvent of all these things, and we've never found an answer. What do you substitute for it? I think that. I quote, I think, Eric Fromm, the psychologist, who talks about how when people have this sort of escape, when they have all this freedom, they search for an escape from freedom. Because you tell somebody, the great news of the world you live in today is you get to decide what the meaning of life is. You don't need to ask the church or your king or the lord of the manor or a priest. You get to decide. Most people find that deeply unsettling. And they would rather consult the Quran or the Bible or the Torah or whatever it is. They would rather consult a priest. And to to be in that situation, Fromm argues, you end up searching for an escape from freedom. And he talks a lot about how people like, Italian immigrants would come to New York and go into the mafia because they were searching for a kind of pre-modern, familial, kind of a group based on relationship and trust rather than money and transactions, which would be the modern liberal alternative. And we haven't filled that hole in the heart that I think most people feel as they lose religion and tradition and community.
Well, you do have some suggestions as to what can be done. You talk about sort of civic community, in fostering a sense of civic community, education in order to do that, and you mention universal nations. What do you mean by the concept of universal nation? I know it's not your phrase, but what do you mean?
Yeah, so first, I think that what can you do? You can't, part of what I point out in the book is while we all see these things eroding, they're eroding because of free human choice. Churches would not be empty if people went to church. Yeah. It is the act of people choosing freely not to go to church that makes them empty, and we now bemoan that. The movie theaters, for example, wouldn't be empty if people just went to the movies instead of watching home at Netflix. They wouldn't be, it's all happening because of human choice, consumer choice, and things like that. And so it's very hard to rebuild because, you're pushing against the wind. You're trying to remind people that while in the short term they may make these choices that seem to kind of maximize individual convenience, in the long run you lose something that's irreparable. And so trying to do it is hard work, and you're trying to search, what pieces of community can you build, what elements can you shore up in various ways. I talk about national service. I know the Prime Minister's proposed that, and it's unpopular. But I think in America it would be, I don't know enough about the British case, but we really now barely know each other when across the political divide. We barely know each other across the rural-urban divide. I sometimes ask people in New York, how many people do you know who make less than $70,000 a year, and who don't work for you? And often the room is entirely silent. And that, by the way, 75,000, that's the median income. I mean, that's 50% of the country makes less than that.
Well, that's a sort of hardening class system in America.
That is. Yeah. And one of the things during World War II and after that allowed for a sense of national unity and civic culture was the army and the draft and things like that. So in some way trying to do that. Look at how Singapore has built a real national identity out of nothing because it has things like that. So I do think you have to search for those kinds of things. You have to search for ways in which you can build, shore up, strengthen community, bits of tradition, bits of, I don't think we can all live life. I have to confess, I'm perfectly comfortable living a life as a kind of rootless cosmopolitan. I don't mind it. I derive enormous sense of pride and purpose from the fact that, we are inheritors of this extraordinary tradition of the Enlightenment. But I understand that that's not for everyone, and that for a lot of people, just what David Goodhart calls the being rooted in being from somewhere, in a metaphorical sense, is very important.
I think just on Rishi Sunak and the National Service, I think it probably would have been more popular if it hadn't come it felt like a desperate last move from something.
And I think, the thing about Sunak, who I admire in many ways, very hardworking, it all feels like it's focus group generated, poll generated, some technocrat who really would much rather be fiddling with the numbers it says, what should I say? It doesn't feel there's something soulless about the way in which he connects with people. And, I say that it's a very hard business, politics, because you're trying to connect with people emotionally. I just think, as the D-Day business showed, it's just hard for him. And so I think you're right. It doesn't feel like it comes from the core of his being. Whereas when Clinton would do it, and he also proposed many things like that, you got the feeling that this was something that he really believed in. He was passionate about. Do
you think? When it comes to sort of community cohesion, binding community together, and that civic thing you're talking about, I mean, do you not need, it's sad to say it, but it's true, do you not need an out-group to hate and fear to really bind a people together?
Historically, absolutely. I mean, so to the extent that among those things that we've talked about that have had this ability to anchor people, tribalism and nationalism is one of them. It's not the only one. Religion is one, community is one, family is one. But tribalism absolutely has historically depended on the scary other. And look, you see that, in the politics today, right? I mean, certainly in the United States, there is a great deal of othering on both sides. I think, to my eye, in Britain, it happens a bit less than in the United States. But certainly in France, you see it very strongly. But you even see it in places like India and Turkey. I mean, when you watch Erdogan or Modi at work campaigning, what they're basically doing is taking the frustration of the less educated, less urban, less cosmopolitan, and saying, I know, I understand your anger at those people in the cities and in the universities, and I am your representative. I will bring you retribution. I'll be your voice. So yeah, you've always needed that. To a certain extent, one could argue that Europe now has a bit of that with Russia because of the Ukraine war. But our internal divisions seem larger than our external. During the Cold War, there was a kind of disciplining factor about the Cold War because people felt an existential competition with the Soviet Union. I'm guessing you're younger than me, and so you didn't live through it. But it's difficult to make people who didn't live through it understand that. And I grew up in India, where it was one of these countries where everybody was wondering which way is it going to go? Is it going to go the Soviet way? Is it going to go the American way? And that was a very palpable sense that the direction of history was at stake. I don't think we feel that way with Russia or even with China today. People pretend that they do, but I think in some ways it's the success of this liberal project or social democratic project, call it what you will. I don't think any Western society thinks, oh my God, maybe we're going to all become Chinese communists and, or we're going to all become Putin. We worry about their infiltration. But in a sense, that Fukuyama was right. That debate is over.
Well, you also wrote The Post-American World. Are you much less optimistic about the world now than you were then?
I think the one thing I didn't anticipate in that book, I talked about the rise of the rest and how these new middle powers are reshaping world order, and how I think I got pretty accurately the degree to which the international system becomes much less manageable. No matter how powerful you are, and the United States is very powerful, when you have countries like India and Brazil and Indonesia and South Africa, in Saudi Arabia and Iran, all acting on their interests and acting, wanting their seat at the table. What I didn't anticipate was the degree to which the challenge to a kind of liberal international order would come from within the liberal powers, from within the United States, of people saying, I'm fed up with, we don't want to bear these burdens anymore. We don't want to uphold this. There's a kind of Atlas shrugged problem, which I think might turn out to be the biggest of them. If you look at the capacity of what I call in the book the West Plus, the United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Singapore, we're much more powerful than we were during the Cold War. I mean, we're at 65% of global GDP, 80% of global military spending. But, we're not really united. We're not really cohesive. And within, there are deep divisions of people who feel like, what is the liberal international order done for me? Yes. That may be the fatal problem.
Well, and within there are divisions. The divisions are liberal. I mean, a lot of people talk about the cultural war as a civil war within liberalism, because let's say on transgender rights or something, you have feminists and quite often gay people very angry at the sort of transgender agenda. So that in a way is a clash of progressive forces.
Oh yeah, I think much of this. It's, if you think of liberalism broadly construed as classical liberalism, the kind of legacy of the Enlightenment, it's all debates within the liberal project. It's in a sense some people privileging economic liberty, some people privileging other forms of liberty, and as you say, in the case you point to, it's within groups trying to figure out, and each one claims heir to the Enlightenment tradition of saying, well, I just want equal rights for everyone. I just want equality of opportunity. And the other side saying, well, you can't really have equality of opportunity when you start at such different positions. So you make everyone is speaking within the terms of the language of liberalism and the Enlightenment. I mean, that's the ultimate victory that has taken place. Even dictators now feel like they have to stage elections.
Yeah.
I mean, the only ones who don't, interestingly, are the communists. The Chinese don't bother to do that, but Putin, it shows you how Russia has still that influence of the West and of the Enlightenment. He still seems to feel the need to stage an election. And they do it in Kazakhstan, and they do it in Belarus, and they do it in Egypt. It's kind of, in some ways, it tells you that you've won the ideological wars when even the enemies of liberalism have to pretend to be liberals.
Well, and then taking it back to America, you have a lot of Americans who don't trust the 2020 election results, who do think it was rigged or stolen in some way, and that shows that it's in Russia and in America, there's a sort of cynicism about the democratic process. Yeah,
and it's the loss of faith in a sense in liberalism, in the sense of what does liberalism mean? Liberalism is all about process, not outcome. It says we don't know what the meaning of life is. You decide that. What we know is we can create structures and frameworks that are fair and we have free elections, which doesn't mean we don't privilege any one candidate. We want freedom of speech. We're not saying any one kind of speech is sacred. And what a lot of Americans are saying is, screw all those procedures. If it gets me to the wrong outcome, I don't like it. And I'm willing to dispense with those procedures, and I'm willing to attack them. And it's a scary reality, because that is, ultimately what the legacy of liberal Enlightenment politics is we can't agree on the outcomes, because remember, the liberal Enlightenment project comes out of 300 years of horrible religious wars in Europe. And so it's precisely because of that, he said, we're not going to tell you what the truth is. We're going to tell you, here's how we can all live by respecting each other. And if you lose that, I think you go down a dark path.
And lastly, towards the end of the book, you quote Kenneth Clark to say that a crisis of confidence is what really destroys civilizations. You would say now that we seem to be suffering a crisis of confidence. How terminal is it? And also, I'd just like you to address, if Donald Trump wins on November 5th, do you anticipate that America will have a similar crisis of confidence as it did in 2016, and you'll get a sort of attempt to what a lot of people regard as an attempt by the elite to suppress the democratic mandate that he had? Or do you think that perhaps there might be a sort of settlement on Donald Trump, that maybe, we just have to accept that this has happened?
So I think, first of all, let's remember that part of the peculiarity of Trump's mandate is that he did lose the national election by 8 million votes, right, or 7 million votes in 2016, and because of the oddity of the American constitutional construction, naturally was legitimately elected. But it's not quite the same as the mandate that you have when you sweep the polls. So it was a narrow win, and that added to that sense of resistance, I think. Look, I think my own view is that the United States will withstand Trump. The country is very strong. We have very strong institutions. Look at the first time around. There were a lot of independent agencies that stood their ground, a lot of courts that were willing to rule against him, even when there were judges who were Republican appointed, even when there were judges who were Trump appointed. And there were areas where he got his way, as he should have. I don't think as much of it as efforts to kind of repress the will of the people, but there were areas where Trump was acting in ways that were unconstitutional. And we're not just a plebiscitary democracy, we're a liberal constitutional democracy, and you do have to operate within the law. And so I think that there was a pushback and there were constraints, and those will still be around. But I do think your broader point is we will probably come to some, I think we'll come to some modus vivendi, internally. I think that Trump also understands now the places where he has leverage. And in some of those areas, I think he'll be very radical in policy, but I don't think that's unconstitutional. The point is just he can't rule by decree. There are issues that have to be legislated by Congress. What I worry about is that we will digest Donald Trump, but will the world be able to digest Donald Trump? Because the area where Trump really has very few constraints is internationally. The president can do what he wants. And the structure of international life since 1945, this open international system, this rule-based international system, which has many flaws, but has extraordinary virtues, has managed to get us through, almost a century of no great power war, no massive territorial conquest. In fact, other than Russia, Ukraine, territorial conquest has essentially been vanishingly rare for the last 75 years. And as you know, that was not true at all for the preceding 75 years. If we go back before 1945, it happened every 2 years. So huge achievements, a rising tide, I would argue, of observance of things like human rights in more and more countries, though, again, very imperfect. But all that has rested on the United States being willing to be the sponsor, the architect, the supporter, the sustainer, the funder of last resort of all of this. And Trump really doesn't believe in that. To his core, the first ad he ever took out as a real estate developer was on how the Europeans were ripping us off on security and the Japanese were ripping us off on trade, and we should just hide behind protectionist walls and get out of NATO, and then everything would be right. That's broadly speaking. And that was his first political views. So I worry that what you will see is, in a Trump presidency, is a fundamentally different relationship with the rest of the world, which could result in the unraveling of this open international system. And that Congress can't do anything about. Nobody could. He's well within his rights to do that.
But I'll let you go in a second. But lastly, a lot of Trump's defenders would say his foreign policy record's pretty good, and they could have things to point at to back up that. Abraham Accords is the one they always mention, but also no new wars. Russia did not invade Ukraine under Donald Trump, and perhaps it wouldn't have done.
Look, there's no question you can have individual transactions that will go well, like the Abraham Accords, and he deserves credit for them. And there'll be such things in the future, I'm sure. But what I'm talking more about is that broader attitude to the system itself. So the way you look at what Biden has done, he's tried to shore up the Western alliance, restore relations with Europe, build new relations with Asia. So these things called like the Quad and the things like AUKUS, bring other countries into a security system that protects, guards, encourages open rules-based system, free countries, being in an alliance with each other. That's the stuff Trump doesn't really believe in. And so I worry that there will be less of that. I worry that is kind of like the underlying architecture of the world we live in. So, there'll be an occasional transaction that will go well. There'll be an occasional transaction that will go badly. But that doesn't change the fact that you're slowly taking off the pilings that were keeping this world order and this international system afloat. And if that goes away, the fact that he got a good deal with the UAE and Bahrain, to recognize Israel, feels to me like very small recompense.
Fareed Zakaria, thank you very much for coming on Spectator TV.
Yeah, it was a great pleasure to talk to you.